I'm Mike Graham. This is Putin's War, your weekly update on what's been going on in Ukraine, what Moscow is saying, and what's happening back home here in the UK. I'm joined, as ever, by Hugh Andree this morning. Thank you very much for joining us, Hugh. Been a big week for Ukraine. Suddenly the President, Volodymyr Zelensky turned up, much to everybody's surprise, one morning this week, and asked for some jets.
Big week. Fast jets, surprise visits.
Yes.
And whilst all carrying on with a sizable offensive building up in eastern Ukraine. So I think probably the background behind the visit, the surprise visit, was the fact that there's been a huge build-up of Russian troops in and around the Bakhmut, the city of Bakhmut, in East Ukraine. Now this is quite timely, and I think the visits are quite timely as well. If you remember, before Christmas, the Russians mobilized 300,000 new troops. Well, their training's coming to an end now. When I say coming to an end, it's probably within 10 days of it being completed.
Yes.
And the idea and what the intelligence services believe is that 200,000 of these mobilized troops are going to be moved into the East Ukraine region around, the cities neighbouring Bakhmut, which is in the Donbass region, and the neighbouring Luhansk region. That's quite significant because if the Russians are successful in taking Bakhmut, it will allow them to push on north to the cities of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, therefore giving them that corridor all the way through.
And I saw a report from Bakhmut actually just this week, and the shelling is constant, isn't it? Because I was listening.
Yeah, the tempo of war has definitely increased. The shelling has increased, and on the ground there are more and more reports of the shelling, the barrages getting closer and closer, which would suggest that the guns are moving forward, and thereby they are, gaining ground.
And is Bakhmut strategically important for Russia?
Not particularly, apart from those two main cities, which if they can push north and take those out, then that's a big win for Russia. One of the other red flags that's gone up in the last week or two is the arrival of T-90 tanks.
Yes.
Which is, again, quite timely that we've now got tanks on their way, and those tanks won't arrive within the 10 days either. Tank crews still have to be trained. They are being trained. But the T-90 tank is really the only Russian tank that is comparable to the Challenger or the Abraham, the Leopard, mainly because it's got night fighting ability, night vision.
And does it have the same protection that some of those tanks we talked about the other week have?
Yeah, the explosive reactive armour. I imagine it will have upgraded. Certainly it'll have better protection than the T-72. Right. What it also then tells us is that if T-90s are being deployed, it's highly likely that a mechanised armoured brigade is going to be deployed. Right. Now they will be professionally trained soldiers. Up to now, the Russians have been using the Wagner group in huge numbers. And I mentioned them before, and we hear them mentioned a lot.
Yes.
The Wagner group are, to all intents and purposes, they're a private military.
They're a sort of mercenary unit, aren't they?
They're kind of, mercenaries as such, although, and a figure came out of the Pentagon at Christmas that there were 40,000 of the Wagner group, of which 20,000 are convicts.
Yeah.
And that would probably, they get thrown in almost as cannon fodder. They get used elsewhere. They've been used in Mali and Syria. Countries that are friendly with Russia, often the Wagner group can be found. It's privately owned and funded by a close associate of Putin's. And it would also, however, tell a military analyst that if they are now being withdrawn and or they've been expended, and professionally trained mechanised groups are being deployed. That's probably where their main effort's going to be.
Right. And what we saw with Zelensky's visit to the UK was an incredible amount of political goodwill.
Yeah.
You know, the British parliamentary system kind of turned out almost like cheerleaders for him when he made his speech in Westminster Hall. Almost everyone agrees with whatever it is the government is going to do, but nobody's that clear about what the government is going to do, because many of the things that they said they wouldn't do, they're now saying they will do. Planes, possibly, more money, of course, more equipment. But the planes and the jets that he's asking for, Britain can't really help him there, can they?
No, he's asking for F-16s, which are not in service in the Royal Air Force.
Right.
We have the Typhoon, the Eurofighter, and the F-35 came into service. We have about 30 F-35s, there's another 18 on order. The main users of the F-16 in NATO are Portugal, Greece, Poland, Turkey, and of course the US.
Yeah.
But it's quite standardised training for fast jet pilots. And yeah, when you see tanks being deployed in numbers, tanks can only operate securely with air cover. So for me, it was an inevitable step that air cover will have to be provided at some point, and I think this is the beginning of that path. And as we've seen, we've agreed to start training their pilots. And Zelensky's no fool. He knows that whilst we're not the biggest contributor of resource to Ukraine, clearly the US is, with the second largest. And to date, we have, however, led dialogue on a number of issues and a number of, the requirements that Zelensky has, and our partners have followed suit. So he's being smart,
yes,
and thinking that go to the mouthpiece and hopefully the rest will hear.
Well, and he's in Europe as well. He's been to Brussels. He's talked to the European Commission. He's meeting Emmanuel Macron. The question, I suppose, is if this is an escalation, which everybody seems to agree that it is, what does Putin do about it? He's been making noises that there will be retaliation of some kind or another. But what's that likelihood?
Well, it will be an escalation. I read in a report, an Estonian intelligence report recently, which said that their opinion, their view is definitely Putin will want to try and blow Ukraine into submission. He's certainly no signs of him sitting around the table to engage with dialogue. And if he does that, then certainly it's going to bring Russia and NATO one step closer to conflict.
And would there be, we've already seen one incident, haven't we, where a missile sort of strayed into Poland, and I remember you telling me at the time nobody wants this to be a Russian missile, because it was kind of denied that it was, even if it had been one. There will be an incident like that, presumably, if this continues. Possibly,
but equipment on the ground now, wherever it is, can be watched from satellites through the use of drones, etc. It's not difficult to identify and pinpoint where these munitions come from. So, I think Putin would have to tread very carefully if that happens. But time will tell.
So, will he feel sitting in Moscow that this is moving now somewhere where he doesn't want it to go?
I think Putin maybe will look at moving fast. Have fast tempo, get his mechanised brigades moving with tanks, and see if he can capture those two main cities. I don't think for a moment now he thinks he can capture Kyiv. It's not possible. I think he might satisfy for having that eastern corridor, and thereby that land corridor all the way to Crimea, and that might be the negotiation point.
And if he's got 200,000 to 300,000 troops coming to that region, if it doesn't work, then presumably he just has to pack up and go.
If it doesn't work, and Zelensky gets firepower from the air, then Putin's going to really be on the back foot.
So could this be his last kind of push, if you like?
Could be his last push. Yeah, could be. There's still big talk of him running low on kit and equipment. China remains quiet. We shall see.
We shall see indeed. Well, an interesting week. Thank you very much indeed, Hugh Andree, there with his take on what's been happening in Ukraine, and what will likely happen in the coming weeks is going to be pretty lively, we think. This is Putin's War. I'm Mike Graham. Don't forget to check in on YouTube with the Embassy of Mike Graham.